All right. We are live. I'm Richard Lawrence from Agile for All.
I'm Peter Green, also from Agile for All.
Yeah. And so we're really going into the for all direction today, because we've done a lot of live streams in the past about work things, like how this Agile stuff works, some of the nuances around different parts of it at work. And a question that I get a lot is, how does this apply outside of work? And I think there's a naive and not very effective way to think about Agile outside of work. And then there's some alternatives, and we want to explore those today. So I guess we should start with what we don't recommend. And you can argue with me on this. I'll say what I don't recommend. What I consider the naive approach to Agile outside of work is, let's pretend our family or our nonprofit leadership team or whatever is a Scrum team. And so we need the 3 roles. We need to do all these different, go through the Scrum events, have a backlog, all the rest of it. And what I've noticed is that the things that make Scrum work well, there's certain assumptions there, certain things that are required in a Scrum team, like you're dedicated to that team, you have primarily shared work, and you're not working on other things. Or if you are, it's coming to the team. And that can work really well in a product development context, but gets awkward at best when you try to do that, say, with a family.
Yeah, and I think, Scrum was built in the context of developing a product. And I guess you could call your family a product, but that feels a little not quite right to me. And specifically, product development is complex. It's unpredictable, or thousands of variables, but we're trying to build something that you can put your hands on and your eyes on and see it and touch it and feel it and play with it. And so it's a little bit different. It's funny when you said, we don't need all these things. We actually do use those terms in our family.
Yeah.
But it's almost just shorthand. The product owner, because we do some chore stuff where we use some of these things. The product owner is the one that walks around the house in the morning and figures out what's messy and needs to get done today. And then they create a list of chores. So it's a little bit like a Scrum product owner. It's the one that's, deciding what needs to get done, but not quite. And then the Scrum Master basically is in charge of getting everybody together and saying, all right, who's going to work on what chore today? That's about as far as the roles go. So we do use some aspects of them, at least around chores, but we rotate those, and the definition of the responsibility is pretty narrow compared to what it would be in a Scrum context.
Okay. So to me, I think the more interesting thing for us to explore and kind of riff on today is, how has our work and kind of our deeper understanding of the principles and models changed our lives outside of work?
Yeah. I like that approach to it. For me, I've never thought about work-life balance, or at least in recent memory. I don't think about balancing my work and my home life. I think about integration, like work-life. I think Tony Hsieh might have, I always hear quotes and then I don't remember where I heard them from, but I think it might have been Tony Hsieh. He says, we focus on work-life integration. It's all my life. It's not like I'm a different person when I go to work. So the things I learn at home influence the things that I'm doing when I'm working with clients, and the things I learn at work influence my life at home. And it's all kind of the same thing for me.
Right. So in what way can I be a whole and integrated person everywhere I go?
Yeah.
And so I think the thing that you and I talk about sometimes that I think would be interesting to talk about, with the world here, is there are a lot of ways the things that we've come to believe are true in a work context turn out to be more deeply human things that we've applied elsewhere. So one example that comes to mind for me is, so we talk a lot about complexity in our work. We use Cynefin as a framework to think about that. And it wasn't long before I realized that applies everywhere, and that there are a whole lot of complex things in my life. And as a result, I've adopted a very experimental approach to life. I don't just go make changes. I run experiments. I make hypotheses and actually try things out. So a current example, something I'm in the middle of that's, more trivial than some of the big life change ones we've talked about and maybe can get to. Started thinking about getting back into photography with a camera. So I've had SLRs over the years, actually printed my own wedding photos. Was really into black and white film photography for a long time, had a DSLR we got a decade ago that has now become kind of out of date and haven't been using it lately, and switched to the iPhone as the camera. But recently I've been thinking about, like, it might be nice to get back into photography with a camera, and there's some interesting technology out there now. So the way I would have done this in the past was treat it as a complicated problem and do a bunch of research and then throw down a big chunk of money on a camera and hopefully get it right and in one shot. What I do now is an experimental approach. I did enough research to design an experiment. I've got a hypothesis that a particular camera might fit my needs well. And I've got a kind of set of hypotheses about what lenses might work nicely with that. So tomorrow I'm heading to New York for a week for a vacation and work kind of trip. Lots of opportunities to play around with photography in contexts I find myself in, like, gatherings and family stuff and travel and all that. So I rented the camera and lenses from a place that will let me buy them if I like them and give me credit for the rentals. So pretty low risk probe. So I may find out, for a couple $100 that this isn't a good fit for me, rather than spending a couple thousand on the equipment. Or I may discover it's really great and I like it a lot, and I may end up keeping some of it. So rather than one big commitment, I managed to reduce the risk and run an experiment around it, in the same way I would advise a team that I coach to not make a big commitment to a new product or set of features or something, but start experimenting and see what happens.
So number one, why am I not surprised, Richard, that you printed your own wedding photos?
Yeah. Now, I did not do as much of that as I should have, because 2.5 weeks after I got married, I shattered my elbow and still have scars from it.
Uh-huh.
So I was not in the dark room as much as I like. Unfortunately, my wife and I are some of the least sentimental people we know. So I did not do as elaborate printing as I expected. But yes, that was very me.
It is, yeah. That's great. Yeah, you mentioned the human stuff is what's really meaningful. One of the things I'm aware of is that, when you've been using a way of thinking for a long time, your definition of the thing changes as you learn more about it and what makes it work. And the way that I think about what Agile is very different than I thought about it 10, 12, 13 years ago when I first heard about it. And so even when I'm describing what Agile is, I recognize that some people hear me describe it and they say, wait, what? I thought Agile was a way to build software, right?
Mm-hmm. That's what I would have said 15 years ago.
Right. And
it's a great way to build software. And it still is a great way to buld software, but that's not what I say now. So how do you describe it now?
A couple of things that I think about now is there was an HR company that did this survey with a bunch of C-level execs, and they were asking them to rate various attributes of their business as to how important that attribute was in today's competitive business environment. And 3 attributes that they thought would mean the same thing and therefore be ranked similarly were flexibility, responsiveness, and agility. But when they got the results back, agility was at the top and flexibility and responsiveness were fairly low compared to that. And so they followed up with some of the executives that had put agility number 1 and those other things low. And kind of the summary of the discussions they had is that while flexibility and responsiveness are nice, they feel like kind of being driven by the winds of change or just being reactive. And one of the CEOs said, I think of agility as flexibility with purpose. And so at a really, really high level, that's how I think about agility and Agile it's how do we have flexibility in achieving some purpose, which implies that we're clear on what the purpose of a thing is, whether that be a company, what's the company's purpose, or a product, what's the purpose of this product? How do we make the world a better place? Or a family, or a life, what is the purpose of a life or a family? So it gets really big, really fast.
Mhm.
And, when you think about the Cynefin framework and making sense out of things, all of those things are highly complex. They're unpredictable. There are thousands of interconnected variables and how those things work. And we can't just sit down and here's my plan for my life. Here's my plan for my family. That will not survive often a moment of actual life. So being clear on what the purpose of those things is. And then what I'm starting to kind of firmly believe is that there are two aspects to how we effectively be flexible in achieving some purpose. One of them is I would place your example of running an experiment in one of those categories, which is we experiment to learn. We do fast feedback loops. We try something that has minimal risk but potential high upside in learning, and learn from it. And a lot of Agile frameworks have some of that built into it, right? They're kind of built around that concept. The other side that I find is critically important is the human side of things. How do we interact with each other? How do we create connection and safety and relationship? And I think that those two things are like the yin and yang of effective Agile at work and the yin and yang of effective development of purpose in a life or a family.
Well, and the two overlap in the middle.
Yes.
Okay, because we're not just doing experiments on, like, the camera one is,
Mm-hmm.
It's an experiment with a thing, with a purchase. It's emblematic of the experimental approach, but you and I are also frequently doing experiments on human things, which sounds really bad.
Yeah. Not like Frankenstein-y.
Yeah. But like we are trying to ourselves become better humans and interact more effectively with the other humans around us, which is in itself a complex problem and therefore requires experimentation.
Right.
So as we try to become, better leaders, coaches, trainers, husbands, fathers, friends, like all these different things in our lives where we want to improve to better achieve our purpose, that's an experimental thing for us.
Yeah, I think an example that was pretty powerful for me was about 6-7 months ago. I learned about a tool developed by Robert Keegan called immunity mapping, which essentially helps us to try to uncover resistance to hard change, like what's going on psychologically for us there. Why do we hold on to the old thing, even if from a logical standpoint, we know it's holding us back, or it's injuring those relationships, or as I went through the use of that tool to figure out, I have this long tendency to say yes to everything and to try and be great at a wide variety of things. And I had become
to actually be great at a wide variety of things. Like that's, I think part of what feeds into it is that you are a very competent person.
Yeah. And so that becomes part of the story I tell about who I am, right? What's my identity? I remember once I had a good friend that provided me a LinkedIn recommendation, and one of the things he said in there is, Peter's a real Renaissance man. And that was like huge ego stroke for me, like able to be really competent, really good at lots of broad things. And so that's part of the psychology of it, is I get attached to that idea that I can be great at a lot of different things, and that defines my worth and value. And so part of it is that there probably is an aspect to one of the reasons I'm good at the things I do is that I like to integrate thinking from a lot of different fields and see the connections between disparate bodies of research and things like that. So it probably is partially true. But the painful result of that often was that I was just spread thin all the time. And it allowed me to be lazy about deciding what's really important. I didn't have to pick because I would just say yes to everything. And so I went through the use of that tool, the immunity mapping tool. And at the other end of it is an experiment. Like essentially it tries to uncover some hidden, deeply held assumptions about what's true about life. And I came to an assumption that my worth is defined by doing that, but maybe that's not true. And so the test would be, how would I know if that wasn't true? What if I stopped doing something that I was, good at and had invested lots and lots of time working on. And so I ran an experiment, and the experiment I picked just to test it was, what if I said no to every trumpet opportunity for, a limited period of time? How would I feel?
To everyone, not just get more critical about the ones you take.
Yes. Yeah. It's not like I'm going to be more choosy. That's a really hard experiment to run because now it's subjective.
And
Well, this is a good one.
Yeah.
Right. And so I ran the experiment for 2 weeks. And within that 2-week period, I got 2 calls, which were dream calls to play. And I said no to the first one, expecting to feel like, oh, I just gave up a huge opportunity to play with some great musicians. And I felt light and at peace. And like for the first time in a long time, I felt like, that's awesome. And I was shocked by the result. And the next time I got a call was another.
So let me ask you something about this.
Yeah.
I'm curious how much of that feeling was the way you are motivated by being good at things. And in this case, it was being good at keeping that experiment.
Yeah, I'm sure that was
yourself.
Yeah, I'm sure that was part of it.
That from your other assumptions in there.
As soon as I experienced that emotion, then my next question was, what's that all about? It's unexpected. The very next thought I had was, I get to spend that afternoon with my family now. So it was really like a reinforcement of the things that are really important to me, like being a good father and being a good husband. I just made a choice that reinforced the thing that's more important to me. And so as I've kind of processed that over the months, that's what I came to.
So it wasn't just, see, I'm good at saying no too.
That was part of it. I want to acknowledge that's probably part of it. It's like, I can use this tool and I can do it effectively. And when I
can't wait to tell this story in a class.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow, this is going to make a great one. I think there probably was a little aspect of that, right? But since the very next thought was, I'm going to be free that night to hang out with my family, and that was, as I worked through that tool, that was one of the things that I was sacrificing in order to have the ego trip of being a Renaissance man, so to speak, was more time with the family.
So the other call came.
That's right. So I got a second call, and it was a different kind of a call. It was a musician, pretty famous pop musician that doesn't have a great reputation as being an awesome human being, but hires a fantastic band. And I said yes to it. And then as soon as I hung up, I immediately felt terrible about it. Part of it was, there was rehearsals and there were a couple of different performances. And so I immediately figured out, how could I fix it? And I found another trumpet player, a fantastic player that would play it as well or better than I did. I found out he was available. I called the person back and I said, I'm sorry, I made an error here. I thought I was going to be available. I'm not. Would it be okay if so-and-so were to step in and play it? And they said, oh yeah, that'd be great. Appreciate you getting back to us so quickly. And again, the same feeling of relief and joy that, I'd made a decision that was in favor of spending time with the family rather than the other opportunity.
Yeah.
So I did treat it like an experiment, and it was time boxed. So there's some things that we learned from agility, right? From some of those frameworks. And I think one of the things that I've learned personally is that I do tend to go big on something and let the pendulum swing all the other way over. And having learned that over many years, I recognized that this was there was a real risk that I would do this. I'm just going to quit, and I didn't want to quit. So I'm a lot more selective now about, my time and choosing whether to play the trumpet or do a recording or take an engagement. And so it's gotten, I would say I'm one iteration better, and yet I still see it coming up in other ways, like this desire to do everything.
That experiment let you do that, the subject-object move that that Keegan talks about with the immunity map.
Yeah.
Where you were previously subject to that identity of Renaissance man, able to do everything. The time-boxed experiment of choosing to say no to things got you some distance from that. So you didn't have to keep doing that forever. Now it's something that you've got outside you that you can look at. And you can decide, like, I mean, you genuinely are that Renaissance man in a lot of ways, in the sense of having a breadth of skills across pretty diverse set of interests and integrating them well. So now that becomes something you can use instead of something that uses you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So something I'd like to talk about, conversation you actually started several weeks ago, and I didn't follow up on at the time because I thought it might be interesting to follow up on with an audience at some point.
Oh, I appreciate that, Richard. Thanks.
And it's actually about both of us. So so there was a book that you came across that seemed really valuable to you that hadn't resonated with me as much. And your explanation of that was that it was like reading about me. And I don't see that. So I thought it might be interesting. So the book was that, I think, Essentialism.
Essentialism, yeah.
Yeah. So that tells me that maybe there's an interesting bit of tacit knowledge there, something I'm too close to. And it seems like it intersects with this purpose and flexibility and focus set of themes we've been playing with.
Yeah, that's a great point. So yeah, the book is called Essentialism. It's by Greg McKeown, I think is how you pronounce it, maybe McEwen. The book talks about, it was really interesting to me because it describes the aspiration behind that initial experiment, mm-hmm. which is, focus on just the essential things and letting other things go and saying no. So, it kind of hit me at a good time. I had run that experiment and that freed up some time in my life. As I'm reflecting back on that experiment was over a year ago. It felt like more recent to me, but I put it in context of some other things going on in my life related to church and things like that. So it was over a year ago that happened. And so I had gotten some benefit from it, and yet I still found myself spread really thin just with other things. So it's like I had removed one big block of time, and then other opportunities just bubbled in and filled in a lot of those opportunities. So like I said, it was one iteration better. So when I read the book, it's really talking about how to get clear on what's important and how to get better at intentionally saying no to other things and letting those things go, which is hard for me, right? Obviously, based on this discussion so far. So yeah, when I read the book, I immediately thought of, Richard's really good at this. He's really good at saying no to things and really good at focusing on the things that matter most. So I mentioned the book and asked him if he'd read it. And he said, no, I don't. I heard an interview with the author. It didn't seem that interesting to me. And I thought, that makes sense. It's like, you don't need the book. You're already doing it. So yeah, it's another example of integrating a lot of different ways of thinking about what Agile really is, because that's the intention of a product backlog in Scrum, is to put first things first. One of the interesting comments that the author made is that the word priority, going back to the Latin root of that, is first. What is first, right? And he made the point that there was fairly recently, historically, that word was a plural, priorities, because there aren't multiple things that are first. There's only one thing that's first. So he said priorities only starts appearing recently in the English language. It used to be priority is a singular word. It's the thing. So that was interesting.
Yeah, we can talk about having multiple priorities now, which is a way to say not having priority.
Exactly right. And so it was one of the interesting concepts.
I think, to be fair to that change in the language, we have different spheres of our life, different contexts in which we have different priorities.
Yeah.
I've got my priorities for developing as a musician, which sit lower than some other priorities in my life.
Yeah.
But I've carved out some space to work on those. They just move more slowly. Mm-hmm. And that's similar to what we're teaching with a product development team.
Yeah.
Where, like, the importance of having focus and saying no to a lot of things, but you also may have multiple products or feature areas or market segments, things, some of which are moving faster than others because they are sitting further up your list, but others that still move, you're not ignoring them, but they're not your highest priority.
Yeah, and it goes back to having a really clear understanding of purpose, right? Because how do you choose between those? Like for you, how do you choose between how much time you spend on the music priorities versus the church priorities versus the family versus the mountain biking versus the new photography things, right? How do you pick those things? And to me, what I admire about Richard Lawrence is a really clear understanding of what is my purpose here, and what is important to me, and then also the kind of discipline to say no when those things don't line up. So it feels like that's an intuitive thought process for you that I don't think is true for everybody. And so the book was helpful.
And I think one of the ways that I've ended up doing that, and I think I do this with client teams as well, is it's that integration thing. So I am a musician, and so is the rest of my family. And I do music at church and do it with my family. And so there's this integration. I mountain bike and do Thai boxing and tennis with family. I generally don't do sports that I'm not going to do with other people that I care about.
Yeah.
I'm going to do photography as I travel and have time on my own and don't really know what to do with it, or I'm doing it with my family.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that knowing your purpose and having kind of the big why allows you to do is align all those other interests with that so that you can be integrated. You can have your whole life integrated towards that purpose. And so that when I'm a musician, I'm still the same me with the same priority. I'm using it to serve those other things I care about.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same kind of thing that an effective like software team is doing. They've got a larger purpose, and they may be doing a lot of different things at once. And the ones that are really effective are the ones that are like meeting the needs of multiple disparate customer segments at the same time with some feature that's going to help both of them.
Yeah. 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 So that's, I think, goes back to that idea of flexibility with purpose is let's get aligned with the purpose. And then the flexibility part you could interpret that as meaning not locking in one way to do it and kind of responding to things as you learn them. But I also think it can mean being open to cool overlaps of opportunity. So when you describe, I do those things with my family, that's a big aha for me, right? Because I look at the music that I do is largely I leave the family and go play somewhere.
Right.
And for a lot of different reasons, right? Most of the opportunities are not close to home, and the styles.
I intentionally turned down that career path.
Yeah.
A quarter century ago.
Right.
Right. You've kind of gone the professional musician into this field.
Yeah.
I turned down the professional musician route and kept music as a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has freed me up to subordinate music to the other priorities.
Yeah.
Because I haven't had to optimize for that.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm not as good a musician as I would have been if I decided to play guitar for my career 25 years ago.
Right.
But since I didn't, that allowed me to use music to do other things I care about.
Yeah. For those of you that don't know Richard Lawrence well, Richard Lawrence is also highly influenced by theory of constraints. And so when he uses terms like subordinate, I'm always, we need to subordinate to the constraint.
Right. Reminds me of the joke in the movie Legally Blonde when she does her video admissions essay for Harvard, and I can use legal terms in everyday conversation. She objects to being catcalled.
Yeah.
Yes, I can use theory of constraint terms in everyday conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's another way Agile makes it into our lives is, your models change your language, which changes what you see.
Yeah. And those are all tied together, right? We need, for the way that our brains work, we need words as tokens for ideas. Mm-hmm. And so those things make their way in as well. And they influence how we think about things. And so these terms like flexibility with purpose makes its way into all different parts of my life. And, another example that's related to this is, a big focus of our work is on leadership development these days. The model that we love is called the Leadership Circle. And part of the Leadership Circle model has a 360 attached to it. So both Richard and I had an opportunity to go through the process of getting our own 360s and learning about that. And it helps us to understand some of those things that we're subject to so that we can put them out in front of us and consider whether it's helpful and different ways that we might express those skills, talents, and gifts. And the one that came to mind for me when we were talking about flexibility with purpose is that some of my reactive tendencies are around being critical and arrogant, and people that are with us will probably even hear that in the way that I describe things, right? And the things that I picked, the creative competencies that I wanted to pick to really double down on were being more purposeful and visionary, and creating more caring connection. And so that leadership circle model was developed to help leaders and organizations be more effective at leading in their organizations. But it's another example of where those things are not separate. And so I wanted to be a better leader in, helping organizations create more meaning and be more successful and effective. But where I find myself thinking about that shift from critical arrogant to purposeful, visionary, and caring connection, I hear that in my head more frequently when I'm frustrated with something that's happening at home, where one of the kids behaves in a way that I don't like, or get in an argument with somebody. It's almost now like a language trigger. As soon as I notice that negative emotion, those words pop into my head: purposeful, visionary, caring, connection. What is the purpose of this family? What is my vision for how our family can be? How can I use caring connection to help move us towards that purpose, that vision? And that has been just really powerful for me personally at home, as much as it is when I am doing work with clients and doing training and those types of things.
Mm-hmm. So we've kind of danced around it, and we probably should at least talk a little bit about like some of the practices from things like Scrum actually are kind of handy in a home context.
Yeah.
And so there's a video on the Agile for All website that my family and I did for Scrum Gathering a couple of years ago, talking about how we've used a lot of Scrum and Kanban and things for homeschool and chores and stuff like that. And I know you've done a similar thing in your house.
Yeah.
So I guess let's talk a little bit about what parts of things like Scrum and Kanban have been useful, and what parts are really they end up being kind of a cargo cult behavior when you apply them at home. And
right.
I'll share a few thoughts on that and then let you.
Sure.
So for us, one of the most useful principles has been making the work visible. What needs to be done?
It's funny when you mentioned, let's shift to that. That was the very first thing that popped into my mind is let's visualize the work.
Yeah. And even today, we've got this New York trip happening tomorrow. My wife and I were talking about being a bit overwhelmed with all the things we needed to do between now and then. And our kind of intuitive response now was, all right, let's make a list. Let's make it visible so then we can decide what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And prioritize and align it with the purpose and all those things we've been talking about. So you can see in that video and in some of the blog posts around it, which I think we'll post in the comments here, how we've structured that. And we have a pretty different looking board than you might see. We started out with the simple 3-column to do, doing, done kind of thing. And we discovered pretty quickly that not everything in the to-do column could be done right now. And so we organized our kind of input queues around what we could work on. So David Allen's Getting Things Done personal productivity thing was a big influence on me in my early Agile days. And it took a while for me to put the two together and realize they were kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
But he talks a lot about contexts. Like if I need to make a call, there's certain times I can make a call, and there are other times where that's not the right move. Like if I'm sitting in the waiting room in a doctor's office or at the library or something, I probably shouldn't make a call. but maybe sending an email on my phone would be appropriate.
Yeah.
And in the case of our family, we discovered the most important thing about context was what day is it? We would plan out schoolwork and chores over a week, usually on Fridays for the next week. And you couldn't pull 5 days worth of music practice on Monday and be done with music practice for the week, because that's one of those things that needed to happen every day. Or taking the trash out to the curb needs to happen Tuesday night to get picked up on Wednesday. So it was important that that was on our Tuesday queue. And we made some other distinctions over the years, but that was a big one, where copying something from what I would teach a Scrum team, or even a Kanban team, really didn't make sense at home. It was visualizing the work and thinking about kind of the policies or conditions around when can I start a particular thing and how can we make it easier to do the work, right?
Yeah.
Which is knowing which thing to pull next, so I don't have to think about it.
Yeah, and it's on our board. Our board is largely chores now. Originally, we did have things like homework, and what we found that it was that that was less important to visualize for us because the kids were getting assignments, the night before. Sometimes it was hard to plan out ahead of time.
Yeah.
And so what we,
because we could plan it all.
Right. And, we probably could be more disciplined about that, but we didn't find a lot of benefit in it. It felt like busy work. Right.
Yeah.
And so instead
that was an important thing right there that I want to call attention to.
Yeah.
Was you weren't doing it just to do it.
Yeah.
Because the process said so or something. You were constantly evaluating, is this helping us achieve our purpose?
Right. And so instead we kind of created some agreements that, this is the order that things get done in. And we still do visualize the chores because that is collaborative. The homework was less collaborative. And so there wasn't as much benefit to putting that up so that everybody could see it. And instead we check in on progress on a weekly basis. But it's not that we're constantly putting those things up on the board, because that just felt like more work than it was worth in a lot of cases. So
and
it's
we
largely
individual swim lanes, by the way.
So do we.
We don't pretend we're a team. And we do have an everybody lane, which when the kids were younger, there was a lot of school that was everybody.
Yeah.
Reading out loud together on some shared topic. But that one's almost never used now.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that's different from work. Like we're not a team.
Right.
You're not going to do somebody else's homework.
Yeah. And so the visualization that was helpful is where there needed to be communication between multiple people, right? And part of it was accountability, right? We wanted some accountability around things getting done that needed to get done. And so that method that I talked about, where in the morning, whoever's playing the product owner role that week goes and looks around the house and says, here are the chores that need to get done to have a clean house today. Then the kids have worked out a we've worked out a schedule. So they rotate who picks first that day, and whoever picks last always gets the worst chore, right? So they rotate that so that there's some fairness to it. And then they pull them into swim lanes. And then we just have agreements that, chores get done, homework gets done first, then chores get done, right? Kind of a priority for those things. Yeah. Another thing that we found really useful, another concept from Scrum that we did find useful, is that we found that we would see chores in the done column. And then my wife, Annie, would go, let's say the kitchen is clean, right? Would be the thing on the sticky note. She would go look in the kitchen and she would say, that's not clean. And so we realized that we had a different definition of what clean the kitchen meant. And so we actually sat down, and for each of the standard chores, we created a definition of done. Definition of done for the kitchen being clean is the following, and we just created a bullet list. And so that's that list of done, definition of done for each of those chores is printed out and right above the Kanban board where the kids pull their chores in. Now, that's not to say that occasionally that's not met and it slides, right? But it allows us to have a more productive discussion if there is conflict around that. Somebody says, I did it. And we can say, did it meet the definition of done? And then they'll review it and say, oh, okay, I missed this. I better go do that. Often kicking and screaming, but it's clear.
You've probably noticed this. One of the things that stuck out to us as we started visualizing the work in that way was that it changed our relationships as the work that needed to be done and the kind of definition of what done was moved out of the relational context and became object.
Yeah.
So it wasn't us telling them they needed to do those things. So it's like, who's unload the dishwasher on right now? It's not me saying you need to unload the dishwasher. It's the board saying you need to unload the dishwasher.
Right.
And it, in a sense, that's just semantics or just playing at it, but it's a real thing in the relationship.
Yeah.
Especially when there's multiple things that need to be done and we're able to say, these are the things that need to be done today. And it's up to you how you want to approach your day, and giving the kids autonomy over that has been powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And it's meant that our relationship can be something other than taskmaster.
Yeah.
Chasing them around and trying to get them to do things. It's like the board gets them to do things, and we get to interact around other things in our relationships, which is nice.
Yeah. I think another concept related to this is that how much autonomy you give to children is different than how much autonomy you give to professional adults.
Yeah, and it changes as they mature.
Exactly, right. So kind of an understanding of different stages of development that children go through is important here. And so it's actually harmful for a child to give them complete freedom at certain ages, because the stage of development is about figuring out what the rules are. And if there are no rules, it's actually really harmful psychologically for them, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're conscious of that when we decide what level of autonomy to give. So we don't have a family discussion about should we have a clean house or not. We as parents say that is part of our prerogative, and part of the things that we feel is important to teach our children is the importance of a clean house. Because their natural tendency would be in that discussion, some of them would say, yeah, I really value that. And others would say, doesn't bother me, right? If you go look at different children's rooms, you will see that reflected, right?
Our three boys share a room, so you see it as regions of the room.
Yeah. And so we said, as parents, there are things that are our prerogative to decide. And one of the things we're deciding is that we will have a clean house. And as our success at that is variable. I don't mean to point out that, we put these systems in place and suddenly everything just happens and there's no conflict around it. We regularly have conflict around it still. Yeah. But what we have is a way to talk about the conflict that is productive. And so that, I think that's an important thing when we're talking about this is not a self-organizing team with no constraints. And that's true in the workplace as well. There are constraints that need to be in place for a team to be effective. Sometimes it's you are handed a vision or a target customer, and then you're given autonomy in how best to delight and serve that customer. But different levels of autonomy matter, and different levels of constraint matter. And so anybody that's listening that's thinking, oh, cool, I'm just going to make my kids a Scrum team and leave it all up to them. From experience, that doesn't work well.
We actually had to deliberately teach our kids how to use autonomy early on. So when we first started doing this, we started homeschool when our oldest was 5, which meant that the other boys were like 3 and 1, so they were not really participating. But then as we started each of them into it, we would do a sort of daily stand-up around the board every morning. And it wasn't just, here are all the things that you need to do, go. It was, let's together make a plan for you to approach the day, and let's talk through some of the trade-offs. And as our kids got older and their kind of personalities and chronotypes and things sort of emerged, we'd talk through like why the right plan for you is different from the right plan for your brother on the same kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so it's neither like we're just going to tell you what to do nor free for all. It's this kind of progressively teaching them to use their autonomy and make better decisions about what they do with their day.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a little bit of David Marquette's work with, what's the book? Turn the Ship Around?
Turn the Ship Around, yeah.
Yeah, where he had that submarine crew that he had to kind of systematically teach to do self-organization and autonomy.
Yeah.
So even adults need that.
Yes, exactly. Right. Adults need it. Kids need it even more. And so I guess the cautionary part of this here is if you're doing this with kids, be really aware of what they're capable of and what their stage of development is, because it's not a paint with one brush approach.
Yeah, I liked the way a friend of mine did this with his son, who was having trouble with homework and chores and balancing it all and still getting to play and stuff. And he was, I think, 7 or something at the time. The first thing they would do when he came from school was put all the new work on the board for the afternoon, and then together make a plan for how to fit in play and homework and chores, and then he could go play. The play was almost always the first thing that happened because he needed that break from school. But they wouldn't go execute the plan until they had a sense of the whole picture and comfort that he was going to be able to come back and finish it all. And they would decide how much and what kind of play he would do based on what fit on a particular day.
Yeah.
Like maybe today it makes sense to stay close to home and do something relatively quick. Other days, maybe we could go down to the museum together and make a bigger trip out of it because there's less to do back at home later. And I thought that was a great way to deal with the way the work changes every day, but build that habit of, and I've got all these different things to do. How do I handle it so that the most important things get done?
Yeah. So there are kind of 2 other practices that I think would be helpful to talk about. So one is the idea of a retrospective, right? Of kind of getting together as a team, looking back on the last short period of time, figuring out what we want to adjust for the next short period of time that comes from Scrum. And as I'm describing this, I'm realizing that we have become more lazy at this in our family. And so it's a good opportunity for me to say why. Why haven't we been as rigorous and disciplined about this as we were in the past? But for a long period of time, we were very consistent at this, which is having on Sunday evenings what we would call a family council, which looked very much like a retrospective. And the pattern is that we would reflect on how things went in the last week, and we would pick something that we wanted to improve in the following week. And a lot of the tweaks to things like the Kanban board would come out of that. But often the discussions were more around relationship things. And so I remember one of those family councils where I taught the kids the pattern behind nonviolent communication, for example. How do we resolve conflict in a way that is not exerting our will on others, but just being clear about our own needs and how we might make requests to others to help us meet our needs. And so things like that. There's a big poster down near our Kanban board about Chris Avery's responsibility process, where so sometimes the family council was, I have an idea, I'm going to teach the kids about it and see how they want to adopt it. And there was some variability there as far as direction versus autonomy as well in what we picked. Occasionally, Annie and I, as parents, would say, here's what we're going to implement going forward. And sometimes that would be the result of trying so kind of the self-organizing approach. Here's a recurring problem.
Yeah.
Here's what we're going to, kids, what do you think? What are some proposals? And we would use a lot of the tools that Scrum Masters would do. We do proposals with thumb votes and counter proposals, and a lot of those tools, dot voting sometimes. When you were talking about vacation, I remembered when we were trying to pick where we wanted to have our next family vacation, and we used a lot of the tools, brainstorming on sticky notes and affinity grouping and dot voting and addressing concerns, all those kind of things. So we hold this pretty regularly, but occasionally we again need to say, you know what, we're the parents here, and normally we don't do this. I remember saying that language very similar. Hey, I know that normally we allow you guys to choose. Those things are not working. I am going to implement a new rule here. The new rule is as follows. And
do that with things like phones and tablets.
It's funny because that was the one that came to mind for me, is that the new rule is at 10 p.m., your phones come in our room and get plugged in. You need to be up by such and such time in the morning, or you don't get it the next day. And you get it as soon as your chores and homework are done. And so we just implemented the rule. Right. And it led to, kicking and screaming the first night, and then broader acceptance as we went forward. And now it's become a little bit more healthy around that.
Yeah. Well, any kind of last thoughts or bits of advice on this topic of Agile outside of work?
Maybe it's just a summary of, for me, a summary of what's been effective is both on the system side, thinking in experiments, and even those things we do in our family council, We think of them as, let's try this for a week and see how it works. And then on the human side, creating shared purpose, creating connection and safety, and being open and transparent about what's going on for us emotionally. Those things make teams at work really hum. And I find that those things are effective both in a family relationship and other things like church and hobbies, and just individually, I find that those things are critical for me.
Yeah, and I'd agree with all that and don't really have anything to add. So as we wrap up here, if you are reading this later, like any questions you have or comments or suggestions for future discussions or blog posts or anything, a lot of what we share online is driven by what we're hearing from our clients and readers and live stream audience. And so definitely don't hesitate to share those things, and we'll address them in future conversations and blog posts.
And I would say, just to add on to that, we'd love to hear what's been working for you in personal life, in home and family and hobbies and other things. We'd love to hear what's been working for you. I'm always looking for other cool ideas to try out. So if you've had something that's been really effective in your home, whether that comes from a strict Agile background or just in your exploration of the knowledge that's out there in the world, we would love to hear ideas about what's worked well for you in integrating these things.
Yeah. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.